Et donc là, nous allons faire un grand écart chronologique, un grand écart géographique et également un grand écart au niveau de la focale, puisqu'après cette étude d'un mouvement populaire, des bases, grassroots, on dirait en anglais, on va s'intéresser à des discours plus institutionnels, avec donc Sossi Tatikyan. Sossi Tatikyan est une ancienne diplomate d'Arménie. Elle a travaillé sur l'Iran, elle a travaillé à l'agence nucléaire, elle a travaillé à l'OTAN, elle a travaillé également aux Nations Unies, et vous étiez notamment en charge des questions sur les pays africains. Et puis, vous êtes à présent analyste, et vous m'avez précisé, depuis la guerre au Karabakh, et vous êtes également doctorante à la Sorbonne Nouvelle, et vous vous intéressez à la guerre des narratifs. Voilà. Donc je précise, Sossi proposait de présenter soit en arménien, soit en anglais. Donc nous avons opté pour lui proposer de présenter en anglais. Vous pourrez lui poser les questions en arménien ou en français, voilà, comme vous voulez.
Merci beaucoup pour cette invitation et je m'excuse pour ne se présenter pas en français cette fois, peut-être dans quelques mois. My presentation is about legal and political aspects of De-Armenization of Nagorno-Karabakh. And in particular, it discusses whether it is ethnic cleansing, genocide, forced displacement, or voluntary exodus, because all those perspectives exist and there is a discourse about this. However, I have a bit deviated from my original article, which is published in Armenian International Journal of Genocide Studies, because I've written numerous articles on Nagorno-Karabakh issues in the last 5 years, and I've used some elements from my other articles. And I write both academic and policy articles, and I have to admit that I write more policy than academic articles, because I've been in policy for 27 years and in academia for 3 years. So if you feel some policy style in my presentation, I hope that you will not judge me strictly. So the main focus of, in terms of timeline of my presentation is from 2020 44-day war and 2023 final military conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a very painful topic to present, and I prefer to write about it than to speak. However, after some period of time, it's possible to analyze it a bit more calmly than in the immediate aftermath. So, Azerbaijan used different military, hybrid, and soft methods during this period to achieve de-Armenization of Nagorno-Karabakh. In terms of military methods, it was military operations, 2020 large-scale war. Afterwards, it was ceasefire violations between 2022. In 2022, it started creeping military advances, taking advantage of the war in Ukraine, and then it ended with a final 2-day offensive. Apart from that, it also imposed the blockade for 9.5 months, which played a very important role in achieving its objectives. During the blockade, food, fuel, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies were first restricted, and then the blockade deepened, and eventually between July and September 23, supplies were completely banned. Even ICRC, the Red Cross, was not allowed to bring in any humanitarian supplies, and the French regional, the humanitarian convoys by Armenia and French regional regions also were not allowed to enter. Apart from that, Azerbaijan used a lot of hybrid warfare tactics. Lawfare, which means that it manipulated international law to justify the use of force, undermine the rights of Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, and to ensure impunity for its actions. Diplomatic warfare, it rejected any international peacekeeping or humanitarian presence and dismissed and delegitimized international mediation such as OSCE Minsk Group, and misused other platforms of international mediation to advance its objectives. It also used cognitive psychological warfare, which is the main, those two are the main topics of my thesis. It was producing fear-inducing messages through loudspeakers, spreading ethnic hatred, Armenophobia, and trying to intimidate Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And finally, it has been conducting information warfare, very aggressive information warfare, not only against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, but also those international players that have supported them, in particular, and first of all, France, but also European Union, US, and other actors. As we know, in terms of France, it has even turned its information warfare into a hybrid warfare, such as in Nouvelle Calédonie, Mayotte, and also in Sub-Sahara Africa, about which I published articles in Institut Montaigne and FEMES, Fondation Méditerranéenne. Now, in terms of terms, I use this conditional, more or less neutral term, de-Armenization, that I invented in this article. The term ethnic cleansing, nettoyage ethnique, or épuration ethnique, oui? Épuration, ces deux versions, they are both used more widely than any other term by both Armenians and internationals. Here we should admit that Armenian government was using the term ethnic cleansing until recently. Now it has just toned down in order not to harm the peace process with Azerbaijan. However, civil society and expert community continues very actively used this term. Also, European Parliament, PASSE, which is Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, Francophonie, Parliamentary Assembly, also French Senate and Congress, and some American lawmakers of Senate and Congress have been using this term very widely, not only verbally, but also in their resolutions. The term genocide has been used by Nagorno-Karabakh Armenian politicians, ombudspersons, a lot of diaspora figures. Luis Ocampo, who is the previous International Criminal Court prosecutor, Lemkin Institute for Genocide, also American Armenian NGO, Center for Truth and Justice in ICC claim. They have made a claim to ICC. Why this is important? Actually, this has created some polarization in Armenian scholar and expert community. For instance, I've been targeted by the genocide, advocates of the term genocide quite aggressively, to use the term ethnic cleansing, because I was, I think, the first one who used the term ethnic cleansing in an article in March 2022, which was called International Community must prevent creeping ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh. We will show the advantages and disadvantages of both terms. US, EU, UN, and many countries prefer to use displacement or forced displacement, but normally politicians, executive branch of governments are very cautious to use the term forced, or they use exodus, mass exodus. Now Azerbaijan, Turkey and Russia, so they use denialist terms. They claim that the exodus was voluntary and that they had offered integration to Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians. However, this integration in the reality meant subjugation without any self-governance status and any civil and political rights and any international presence to protect their safety and rights. They also use very extreme radical mocking terms. In particular, Azerbaijani propaganda machine was using the term self-genocide at the end of blockade when the starvation happened, and there were real concerns, in particular voiced by Luis Ocampo, about starvation genocide. They said that even if it's a genocide, and it was said by special envoy, ambassador by Azerbaijani propaganda machine for the conflict, then it is a self-genocide because Armenians have imposed the blockade themselves. So our research question is, what is the most accurate and appropriate term to describe the de-Armenization of Nagorno-Karabakh, and objectives is clarify which term is more accurate, compare legal, political, and academic uses and policy uses, and assess Azerbaijan's actions against Armenians and also their lawfare. So the term ethnic cleansing in general means make an area ethnically homogeneous through force and intimidation. Methods include murder, torture, rape, detention, forced deportation, destruction of civilian property, hospitals, use of civilians as human shields. First, it was used during the Yugoslav wars in 1990s, and it is a political and not a legal term. And that's exactly why the advocates of the term genocide have an issue, because this term is often used in policy discourse, but it is not recognized under Genocide Convention and Rome Statute, which is a basis for International Criminal Court. And it is recognized only in some UN Security Council resolutions. In particular, it's one of the 4 crimes under responsibility to protect principle, which was very important in the beginning of this century, but apparently it was literally killed by politicians in the last decade. And it is losing its policy relevance. So it is also linked to ethnic discrimination, such as Convention on Racial Discrimination, in line with which Armenia has made a claim, law case against Azerbaijan in September 2021, and Azerbaijan made a mirroring claim. And then it started demanding Armenia to withdraw its claim from both International Criminal Court of Justice and also European Court of Human Rights as a precondition for signing a peace agreement. And this March, Armenian authorities, in spite of the huge opposition by civil society and expert community, they decided to withdraw the claim. However, it's not withdrawn yet, because actually it's one of the 17 articles in the peace agreement to withdraw mutually international lawsuits, and so it will enter into force only after the peace agreement is signed, and for which Armenia also demands that Azerbaijan stops its reversal of narrative, its propaganda about Western Azerbaijan, by which Azerbaijan means Armenia. However, even if this term is not in those two important Genocide and Rome Statute Convention, it doesn't lead to a legal deadlock, because it is actually, ethnic cleansing is a war, a crime against humanity, which already falls under the Rome Statute. So the critics of the term ethnic cleansing say that it downplays intention and evades accountability, that it is actually a term invented by Milosevic regime to cover up genocide, and that terminology choice reflects political will to act or not to act to prevent genocide, and that number of deaths actually is irrelevant for defining genocide if intention exists. The term genocide means intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Acts include killing, causing serious harm, imposing destructive living conditions, preventing births, forcibly transferring children, requires a specific programming and planning, intention, and finally, denial of the crime is also a criteria for a genocide. The legal term is codified in Genocide Convention and also Rome Statute, and it is a subject for jurisdiction by International Criminal Court, along with crimes against humanity, war crimes, but not ethnic cleansing, although again it can fall under crime against humanity. So the downside of the term genocide is that both academia, scholars, and also policymakers and governments are extremely reserved and cautious to use the term genocide. So they don't jump into using this term, and the abuse of this term, the very frequent use of this term, is not encouraged at all, neither in academia by international law scholars nor in policy circles and politicians. So, in fact, only human rights defenders and genocide advocates, not advocates, but genocide prevention advocates such as Lemkin Institute or other NGOs are more keen to use the term genocide for crimes other than, let's say, Holocaust or Rwanda or Armenian genocide or other major genocides that have been widely recognized. So, forgotten, I will not refer to this because I think many of you know this and we don't have so much time to go through the whole presentation, but it can be shared by email. So I will not refer to the slides before 2020, the history of the conflict, because I think it's quite well known. But I will focus on one important aspect, the similarities of Nagorno-Karabakh and Kosovo conflicts. And I have also worked, my first UN peacekeeping job was 3 years in Kosovo. So my thesis was initially the comparative analysis of Kosovo and Nagorno-Karabakh conflicts. However, after what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, it kind of lost its relevance, and I modified it also to involve the current warfare of narratives between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which has gone much beyond further Nagorno-Karabakh issue. So the similarities of Nagorno-Karabakh and Kosovo conflict were striking in 1990s because they both started in a very similar way during the same period, and with national liberation movement, peaceful movement, and then partisans, and then in both cases, Azerbaijan and Milosevic regime responded to peaceful self-determination movement by massacres and military offensives. And there was, in both cases, a very serious threat of ethnic cleansing. However, after a certain point, the conflicts evolved in a very different manner. Why? Because in case of Kosovo, there was a Western NATO-led, US-led military intervention, and it was followed by UN Security Council resolution deploying a huge peacekeeping international architecture composed by NATO, UN, OSCE, and EU, with their different roles: security, development, institution building. In case of Nagorno-Karabakh, unfortunately, it didn't happen because Russia was the leading actor in the region, and it was manipulating the conflict, playing with both sides and selling weapons to both sides. And instead, it was this ceasefire, and in fact, OSCE Minsk Group, that was the mediating body during 27 years, did offer some plans for settlement in the immediate aftermath, in the second half of 1990s, that were actually similar to Kosovo plan, like 97 plan that Levon Del-Bedrosian wanted to accept was very similar to what was applied for Kosovo. But unfortunately, in Armenia, there was no public consensus between Nagorno-Karabakh leaders and Armenia's leaders at the time. Moreover, actually, it's a big question mark whether Azerbaijan would accept it if Armenia reached consensus, or it would just dismiss this because it had already found oil and gas, and it already had an intention to prepare for a new war and to ensure maximalist achievements through military solution. However, maybe in the immediate aftermath, maybe Azerbaijan could agree. So this is a hypothesis we cannot know now. So this is where conflicts went to a very different direction. However, there is another important element here, that Armenian forces, and by that I mean both Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, took control of not only Nagorno-Karabakh, but those 5+2 surrounding regions. And this is really key, because why I'm saying 5+2, because Kelbajar and Lachin had a special status they were a buffer zone for humanitarian and security objectives. But the other 5 regions was very difficult to legitimize because they were lawfully Azerbaijani, and in fact, let's admit it, for 27 years, there was no any Azerbaijani living in those regions. And this was very difficult to justify from international law perspective. And while during Levon Del-Bedrosian, it was obvious that this is a security buffer zone in order to prevent Azerbaijan to attack Nagorno-Karabakh itself, which Azerbaijan was doing during the First Karabakh War, and also imposing blockade. Then during Robert Kocharian and Serge Sarkisyan, those territories were called liberated territories, along with Nagorno-Karabakh, which kind of very negatively affected the international legitimacy of Nagorno-Karabakh cause. I personally believe that if those at least 5 regions were returned to Azerbaijan during those 27 years, perhaps Armenia would gain international legitimacy by the West, and perhaps it wouldn't lose Nagorno-Karabakh. So the war in... Okay, I still have a lot to say, but apparently I'm running out of time. The war in Ukraine didn't contribute to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In fact, Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians became the collateral damage victim of this conflict, because for international community, the notion of international territorial integrity and sovereignty became almost the only important principle, and the principle of self-determination was not important any longer. Then dynamics between Armenian and Azerbaijan narratives. This is actually the topic of my thesis, but this is very, very detailed, so we have no time for this. But what happened was that between 20 and 23 is that first Azerbaijan started violating the ceasefire in December 2020, just 3 weeks after the ceasefire, occupying Hadrut completely and taking new prisoners of war and destroying monasteries. Then it started turning Nagorno-Karabakh into a gray zone, banning the entry of international NGOs and journalists in February 21. Then there was a relative calm, although it was firing and killing some civilians from time to time, but it was isolated cases. And then taking advantage from the war in Ukraine and the change of priorities of Russia and alignment of Russia with Azerbaijan since then, it basically started advancing military advances in Nagorno-Karabakh. Then it proceeded to serious violations of ceasefire. Then it started the blockade, which was gradual. First, only it allowed Russian so-called peacekeepers and ICRC to take humanitarian convoys, and then it established a checkpoint, and in July it stopped any allowing any humanitarian supplies. Starvation started in July, and then it launched, as soon as the resilience, perseverance of people broke down, it launched a military conquest which lasted 24 hours, and it was called anti-terror operations, resembling Serbian Mladic language for Srebrenica at the time. And then it was about 250 Armenians were killed in those 24 hours. The other 250 died in an explosion of a depot, and 64 civilians passed away from exhaustion during the exodus, and there were many hundreds of injured. However, Azerbaijan completely denies civilian deaths. It denies the forced displacement, and it basically whitewashes and greenwashes what is happening, bringing green villages and smart villages, and while in parallel demolishing and destroying cultural heritage and destruction of property, renaming all villages, towns, and streets, and resettling artificially Azerbaijanis who have never lived in this area, and either destroying or appropriating cultural heritage, calling them anything but Armenian. First it was Udi, and now it's all Caucasian Albanian, distorting Armenian symbols and scripts. So to conclude, in fact, if we look from the legal perspectives, what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, it mainly meets both genocide definition and also ethnic cleansing definition. However, why the school that proposes to use ethnic cleansing, including myself, proposes it, is because the very misuse, very frequent use of the term genocide undermines actually the Armenian genocide of the 20th century, because Azerbaijanis and Turks start mocking it, saying that, oh, you see, 200 people have died, and soldiers, and maybe the same has happened in 1915, but you are claiming that it has been 1 million, and also because in comparison with what is happening in other parts of the world, such as in Ukraine by Russia and in Gaza by Israel, actually the scope, at least human lives were mainly saved. 100,000 people were saved, they lost their homeland, but physically their lives were saved. So it's a bit tricky to call this a genocide politically, because it will be difficult to promote this cause as a genocide. That's why the suggestion is actually to use the term ethnic cleansing and crime against humanity in legal bodies. So thus I will conclude, although there is a lot to talk about, but we run out of time. Thank you very much for your attention.